The next control that we'll talk about is the update panel, and I happen to personally think this is one of the more fun controls to play around with in ASP.NET, because with just a minimal amount of code on your part, you can enable AJAX calls and you don't even have to know any JavaScript. So the update panel control does require the script manager. If you recall from the previous section, the script manager loads required AJAX scripts, and it initializes a special client-side JavaScript object called the page request manager. Well, that page request manager is actually used by the update panel control. So as long as you've added a script manager into your page or into a master page, then you can use the update panel. What does the update panel do? Well, it allows you to wrap portions of a page that need to be AJAX enabled, so that if a user clicks, for instance, a button in that section of a page, the contents of that section can be updated asynchronously or through what we call a partial page postback, or you'll hear partial page update. This allows a really easy way to make it so the whole page doesn't have to reload. Now it can do some other things as well. You can actually cause buttons outside of the update panel to be clicked and then cause a certain part of the page to update, and that's called an async postback trigger, which we'll see in a moment. You can nest update panels, so if you have a master parent update panel and want to nest a child inside of it, in more complex scenarios you can do that so that only the children will be updated, for instance. And then it provides a content template that you'll be using called content template, and the content template simply is the wrapper for the content you would like to AJAX enable in a particular page. So here's kind of how it works. You have default.aspx, and let's say that you have a simple form in there and you would like the user, when they click that form, to not have to reload the whole page. You just want to show the results of the form and let them keep going on that page. Well, to do that, you can drag an update panel control onto the page, and that update panel control would have that content template. The content template then would have the contents of the form, and in most cases even the button that would be clicked. When the button is clicked, the XML HTTP request object you see here would trigger an async postback to the server. The server then will process the data, and then it will send that data back, and the update panel will then update this portion of the page. Now the rest of it, though, if there was a header, a footer, maybe a menu over here, will be left alone. Nothing happens. How does it work? Well, behind the scenes, the update panel interacts with the page request manager that I showed you earlier, and it intercepts, in essence, the normal postback operations that would occur, for instance, when a button is clicked, and converts those into asynchronous postbacks or partial page postbacks. And as I mentioned, it uses the XML HTTP request object that's available in every major browser out there nowadays. Now it does send information in the control, so if you filled out text boxes or something else, that data will be posted back to the server with the XML HTTP request, and it also sends something called view state along for the ride as well. View state is generated as you use ASP.NET Web Server controls. Now in many cases that might not be a big deal, but if you're finding that your update panels aren't responding quite as quickly as you'd think they should, you might want to go make sure that your view state's not too big. See how big that is and how much is being sent. Now when the response message comes back from the server, the update panel will automatically take the HTML that's sent back and update the appropriate part of the page. Absolutely no JavaScript is required out of the box. Now, as you move past the update panel, you certainly can write JavaScript to integrate more sophisticated ways with the page request manager, but it's not required out of the box, as you'll see as I do the demonstrations. So here's an example of what the update panel control looks like, and I'll run a demonstration similar to this coming up. In this case, we have the update panel, we have the standard ID and run at server attributes, and then here's our content start tag and end tag, content template property. Now inside of here we have a grid view and we have a label, and in this particular case we'd like any action that occurs within this content template to be asynchronously updated, or in other words an AJAX call. Now what will happen then is the update panel will intercept sorting on the columns or clicking on a paging icon or link and automatically send that back to the server in the background and then update the HTML that comes back. So it'll be not only faster but of course, the whole page doesn't have to reload. Now there's some other things you can do as well. In cases where you might have some controls that are outside of the update panel, sometimes you might have a search form or something that's not something you can wrap in the update panel itself within the content template, then you can actually tie the external control into the update panel AJAX call operation. And the way we do that is we add a triggers tag, and you'll notice I have this async postback trigger, and I give it a control ID. What we're saying is I would like button submit to participate in updating this update panel. So you'll notice down here outside of the update panel content template, I have button submit, standard run at server, and then we say up here on the async postback trigger, when button submit is clicked, so you have to define the event name, then we would like the, in this case, the grid view to be updated with fresh data from the server. So although this control is outside of the update panel, we can still interact with it and cause it to perform an async postback for us. So let's take a look at how we can use the update panel and its content template. Using the update panel is quite simple. We can start with a page that we'd like to AJAX enable, add in the functionality, and then we're ready to go. So I have a page that we did earlier in the Script Manager demo that I'm going to start with, and it had a reference to a custom JavaScript file. So I'm actually going to just comment this particular code out right here because, well, we really don't need it. So I'm going to say comment selection. Now from there, what I'm going to do is, let's say that we would like to add a label. We'll keep it real simple to start. And we'll say this is our time label. And then under that, we'd also like to add a button. So we'll do an ASP button. And this will simply get the time. So when this button is clicked, let me go ahead and switch over to Design View. We want to go in and update our label. So we'll simply say time label dot text equals, and we'll just do datetime.now, too short, time string. Okay, so very, very simple, pretty straightforward C# code there. So let's go ahead and build that. It looks good. Let's right click and view in browser. And we'll hit get time, and you'll notice it does work. But if you look up, you'll see the little E up here kind of flashes, and it's still fast because I'm of course hitting my local server, but it's definitely not an AJAX call. So to make this into an AJAX enabled page, it's very, very simple. We can come into the toolbox. I'm going to go ahead and pin that. We'll come down into our AJAX controls, and because I already have the Script Manager from the previous demo, I don't need to redrag one of those. In fact, you only want one of those. But we can drag on our update panel. So I'm just going to drag that right in there. And then I'm going to grab these controls and we're going to move those into the update panel. So I'm actually just going to grab them right here. And if you recall, there's a content template. Alright, so there we go. That's all we have to do to AJAX enable that part of the page so that when the button is clicked, the label will get updated as appropriate. So let me view in browser now. We'll do get time, and you can kind of watch the E up here. You'll see there's absolutely no flicker at all this time. It's so fast you really can't tell that anything's going on as far as hitting the server. Now it did actually hit the server though. How do we know that? Well, one of my favorite tools to use is called Fiddler, and you can go to fiddler2.com to grab this. And if you just click on Get Fiddler, you can install it. It's a very small download. So we're going to go ahead and run it directly. Let me go ahead and install it. Very fast install as well. And we're ready to go. Now, I normally keep Fiddler right down here on the bottom. And so I'm going to go ahead and add that. We'll right click and say Pin to Taskbar. Now what Fiddler is an HTTP proxy tool. It intercepts messages that go from the browser to the server. And so if I go ahead and start it, you'll see it at first glance might look a little bit complex, but it's not bad at all once you get the hang of it. And it's very, very useful in AJAX scenarios. So right off the bat, you can see Fiddler went out. If we come over to our inspectors, and it made a request up to the Fiddler site to check the version, and you can see it returns some version information right here. I'm going to go ahead and clear that out by clicking the X and saying remove all. Now let's go ahead and rerun the page and let's see what happens here. So I'm going to view in browser, we'll get time, let's go look at Fiddler. And you'll notice that default.aspx is first shown, but then it's shown again. And the reason for that, this is the first load, and this is everything that was loaded into the browser. So here's the script manager scripts, here's the page request manager that the script manager initializes, here's our update panel area with our span and our button. But let's go look at the second one. This should be the AJAX call, and here it is. So you'll notice that the data sent up, if we pull this up in Notepad and go a little bit bigger on the font, this is actually the data that was sent up. So it knows the update panel that was being updated. Here's information about the button. Here's the view state that's standard with ASP.NET controls, and some other information from the form. And now you'll notice that we can tell this is an async post. Async post is true. So we could actually come in and on the server side, we could have written some code to only update this if it was an async postback. But because the button is wrapped in the update panel, it always will be, so there's really no need there. But you'll notice that the data that came back includes the HTML that should be rendered in the update panel. Notice that we actually have the full-on span with the time label ID. This is our label control as it's rendered to the browser. And then we have our button, and then we have some other data such as the view state and some other things we won't go into here. But these are actually really important because basically what happens is this all gets parsed, and this information right there is updated in the page. And that's what we see when we run it. And so if we go back to here, view in browser, that AJAX call you can see is not sending the entire HTML back from the server, only parts of it. Now, another reason this might be useful, the Fiddler tool and using the update panel in conjunction with it, is if we go back and let's just to demonstrate this, let's throw a new application exception. And we'll do my favorite. An error has occurred. Not the most fun error to get. And let's go ahead and build that. All right, now it should load fine. But now let's hit this, and you'll notice that we do get an error. It just says an error has occurred, but we can't get to the stack trace, and we really have no idea other than the error message of what occurred. Now there's some things you can set on the script manager, such as the async postback error to show. But let's go look at what Fiddler has to offer here. So here is the actual initial load of the page, and here is the data that was actually sent back. And you'll see that it's not much better than what we had, but at least we can see the raw data that was sent. So let me clear all that. So what do we do then? How do we know exactly what happened, what line number, all that information? Well, one of the tricks I mentioned earlier in the initial discussion of the script manager was we can come in and we can do it through typing, or it's actually just easier to go to the properties. And we can set the, right there, enable partial rendering to false. Now what that does is turns off the AJAX functionality. So we have a problem, we're not sure why. I really don't want to strip out the update panel here that I already have. I took a little bit of time to put that together. So let's run it now. We'll hit get time, and now notice we get what we would be used to getting in ASP.NET. So that's a really nice technique you can use if Fiddler doesn't have the information you need. Then we can jump into this and take a look at the actual error simply by setting partial rendering to false on the script manager. So let's go ahead and set that back to true, and we'll go ahead and we'll take out our error here. And now everything should be back to normal. So let's run it one more time. Our AJAX call's made, and now we're working. So it's a really nice trick that if you're working with the update panel, you're not exactly sure what's going on, but you don't want to rip out the update panel and the script manager and all that from your HTML source, then that's what you can do to go in and enable it. Now let's say that the button was actually stored outside of this. Let's say for whatever reason, maybe it was up top in another part of the page, maybe it's up in the header. And for whatever reason, we can't actually wrap the label and the button because they're in separate parts of the page with one update panel. Well, if we do it as is, if we run the button and run the page with that, you'll see that everything still works, but you'll notice if I do it again, the E here will kind of flicker. You'll see it's flickering there. And that's because we're not doing an async postback at this point. Now the reason for that, of course, is the button is outside of our update panel. So to remedy that, let's go ahead and we could either A, move it inside, of course, but we're going to say that's not possible. So we're going to leverage the update panel's trigger functionality. So I'm going to come over to our update panel, go ahead and highlight that and go to the properties. And you'll notice we have this triggers collection. So I'm going to click on that. And there's two types of triggers you can add. You can do a regular postback trigger, which just does a standard postback, not something I really want in this case. It's already doing that. Or an async postback trigger. So I can select that. We can now go in and say, what's the control ID? Well, now we can come in and actually pick the button, and then what's the event name on that button that triggers the async postback? Well, we want the click event. So we'll hit OK. So just by hooking up the triggers that you see here, we can now go in and easily tie in this button to this update panel so that if the button gets clicked, we can automatically update the label, but we'll do it asynchronously using an AJAX call. So let's go ahead and run it now. Kind of watch up top here. We'll do get time, and notice no flicker at all. And if we go to Fiddler, let's go to the very last one, you'll see that it is indeed an update panel request and a response coming back. There's no, this is the entire page. This is what we'd see if it was reloading the whole page. But instead we're seeing very small fragments of data sent back and forth. So that's an example of using the update panel and really just getting started with it. So in the next demonstration, I'm going to show you more uses of it, and we're going to tie it in to the time card demo that was created in earlier modules. In previous modules, I built a simple timesheet viewer application that allowed employees to be selected and then their time cards to be viewed. And so if we run this, we have a very simple master page, has a header and a footer, and then we have the content in the middle, and we also have a printable master page where it strips off everything. So as we select different items, it is reloading the entire page. Can't really see that here because I'm running it locally, it's very fast, but if we watch up on the E again, you'll notice that it does reload the entire page. So what I'd like to do is AJAX enable this application. Well, the first thing I need to decide is where do I put the script manager control, because we do have to have the script manager. And so if it was only used in this page, I'd say put it just in that page, but I'm going to assume that we might have other pages we'll add that need the script manager control. So we're going to go ahead and run off to default master, and you'll see that I have a script manager placed in there. And I didn't even do anything fancy at all. Literally added an ID and the run-at server on it, and we're ready to go. So that's already been drag and dropped on, and that's all we have to do to get going. Now from here, we can come into the timesheet viewer, and we can wrap an update panel around the content we would like to handle, which would be these two grid view controls. And so the easiest way to get that going is we'll just drag an update panel right here, and in that update panel we can go ahead and put these guys. So I'm going to run back to the source and just copy those in, keep it really simple, make sure we grab what we want. And we'll come down to the grid view, and you don't even have to put the object data source controls that I have inside of here. So let me grab this one and we'll put it outside just to demonstrate that. Okay, so now what we have is the two grid views that drive showing employees and showing timesheets available inside. And let's go ahead and run it as is. Okay, and you can see everything's displayed. Now let's watch up here on the E. We'll hit select, and you'll notice that nothing is being reloaded up here. We're now doing AJAX. Now that seems great, and at first glance that's about as simple as we can get. Let's go ahead and pop open Fiddler here. We'll clear out the existing calls that have been made. And let me just refresh the page, and then we'll select an item. Alright, so if we go back, you'll notice some scripts were loaded, but here's Timesheet Viewer being loaded initially. And you can see there is quite a bit of data here that was loaded for the first grid and things. And then here's the second call that was made. And so right off the bat, you'll notice that here's the data that was sent up, and there's a fair amount of view state in here. It goes all the way to about there, and that's because of the grid views. And then here's all the data that was returned, including the updated view state. But you'll notice that we have two tables. Here's our bottom grid, which is the time cards, and here's our top grid, which is the actual employees. Now, while that works, the employees aren't changing. There's really no reason to put those inside of the update panel, because really all we want to update is this bottom table. So one of the nice things we can do is we can come back into our update panel, and what I'll do is grab this grid, well actually the one right above it, that represents the employees, and we're going to put that outside because we don't want to load that except for when the page first loads. So we'll put that outside, and I'll also move the BR tag, put it right below it. Okay, now the challenge though is if we run it, let's watch again the loading up here that occurs. You'll notice it is posting back the entire page, and if we go back to Fiddler, we can verify that. Here's the page and everything's being loaded. So not very efficient at this point in our application lifecycle, because we might as well be doing a full page postback. So to fix this, all we have to do is leverage the trigger functionality that I demonstrated earlier. So we can come in to our update panel, which should be right down in here. And here's the grid view inside of it. Now you'll notice I'm not able to get to it real easy, so I'm going to run off to the properties, and we're going to come into here and see if we can find it. So I'm just going to click, and there's my update panel right there, update panel 1. So if you can't see it visually, you can always go to the properties window and select it. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is go to the triggers collection. I want to add an async postback trigger to trigger an AJAX call, and the control I'd like to target is the first grid, which is grid view 1. Now the event is going to be when the selection changes, and you'll see we have a selected index changed right here, and when that selected index changes, we want to go ahead and trigger the AJAX call, and we'll hit OK. So now all that did in our source is added this trigger, very similar to what I demoed earlier in this module, and we have an async postback trigger. It targets the grid and the selected index changed event. Now we've tied in this grid that's outside of the update panel, and we've tied that into the update panel itself. So now it will trigger an async postback. Let's go ahead and save and run it. Now watch up here on the E again. We'll select. Notice absolutely no flicker at all. And that's because now this is only loaded once. Let's go prove that by looking inside of Fiddler. And notice that here is the actual HTML that was updated. It only has the timesheet data. You can see some of that data here for the hours. It didn't update the external grid, or the employee grid in this case. So this is much more efficient in situations where you have a control that really only needs to load once. So you don't want to put it inside of an update panel, because if you do, it's going to reload multiple times. So that's an example of how easy it is to use the update panel, but also integrate triggers to AJAX enable our timesheet viewer.